What is going on today, guys? My name's Alex. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are back with this 2023 F150 with the 5.0 liter COYOTE engine. And if you remember, last week we talked about all the good things, the things I really liked about this engine, all the pros. So if you're interested in that, check that video out. But this week we're going on the dark side. We're talking about things I don't like about this 5-liter COYOTE engine, as well as some common issues and potentially how to avoid them. So that's what we're doing today. Should be some fun. So despite this being a relatively negative video, right off the hop here, we'll start with some positive. And the nice thing is that this 5-liter COYOTE engine has been around since 2011. So it's been out for quite a long time. And usually when that's the case, that is because the engine has a good design to it, there's limited flaws, and the consumers like it. So that is a good thing right off the bat. Now, as you would expect, the earlier generations of the 5-liter COYOTE engine did have quite a bit more flaws or issues than what we have in the current 4th gen model in this truck. So as we get into the video, you'll see that some of these common issues are resolved with the newer engines, which is always good to see from Ford. And to kick things off, we will start with an issue just like that. So the first generation of COYOTE engine from 2011 to 2014, they were known for having potentially connecting rod bearing failures, which could lead to a complete catastrophic engine failure. So not good. Again, not the most common issue, but something to talk about, which is what we're doing. I believe the issue was later discovered that the connecting rod bearing clearance was not correct, and that could lead to complete bearing failure, then engine failure. Luckily, this issue has stayed with the first generation of engine, and any engine built after 2015 no longer has to deal with these issues. So if you guys are looking at buying one of those engines between those years and you hear any kind of knocking, ticking, I would probably just walk away, because like I said, those connecting rod bearings have been known to fail, and usually when they are about to fail, you start getting a ticking, a knocking noise in the engine. Another common issue in the earlier generation of engines was the head gasket failures. Now, luckily, they were not an internal head gasket failure where you're either burning coolant or burning oil. They were external head gasket failures for the most part. And what you would see is you would have your head gasket leaking oil. Now, this is not necessarily catastrophic unless it starts leaking a lot of oil. And you can usually seal it up with some block sealer. Now in 2018, with the 3rd generation of COYOTE engine, Ford completely redesigned the head gasket, and that has basically eliminated this issue, which is nice to see. Another common issue that does seem to still be impacting even the newer engines is the mass airflow sensor. For whatever reason, seems to get dirty, and it kind of screws up the sensor itself. And this can cause rough idling, lack of power, misfires, and even stalling if it gets that bad. Luckily, it's really not that bad of a fix. You can either clean it out yourself, or if the sensor is just gone bad because of the dirt and debris, you can replace it. It's really not that big of a deal. I think the sensor costs like $100. So now, speaking of air intake, the throttle body on these 5 liters also seems to get dirtied up, get some gunk in there, and can have it stick, which again is going to lead to possibly rough running engines, rough idling, misfires, and again, even stalling if it gets that bad. So if you do notice any of that, I would probably just take apart your throttle valve. It's literally right there. It's not that big of a deal, and clean out your mass airflow sensor as well as your throttle body itself. And any parts store will sell mass airflow cleaner. It's basically just like brake clean. It'll take all the gunk out of it, and you can all reinstall it, or you can even pay someone to do it. It's not going to be that big of a deal. But like I said, I think it is still important for you guys to be aware of that. Another common issue on these 5-liter engines is spark plug and ignition coil failures. Now, it seems like maybe the bad spark plugs could potentially even cause ignition plug failures, but either way, it does seem like both of those are failing a little bit prematurely on these 5-liter COYOTE engines for whatever reason. Now, one of those failures, whether spark plug or ignition coil, will 100% cause a misfire, and it will need to be addressed right away. So not catastrophic, but it could potentially ruin an afternoon. But the silver lining is that also is relatively an easy fix, and it shouldn't break the bank. Another known issue with the 5-liter, and probably the loudest right now, is oil consumption. That's the reason why I'm actually reshooting this, because I just really wanted to make sure that I got it right. So starting in 2018, pretty simultaneously with the release of the 3rd gen COYOTE engine, people started realizing that their 5-liter engines were burning an excessive amount of oil. Now, at first, Ford came out and said this was just normal. However, as we'll talk about in a second, they actually, backtracked on that. Every engine does burn some amount of oil. There is going to be some oil that gets past the piston rings. Oil actually lubricates the cylinder walls at all times. So there is always going to be some oil in the combustion chamber that gets burned. However, with a newer, healthy engine, you really should not notice any change on the dipstick from oil change to oil change. You really shouldn't. Now, there is one exception to this, and especially with pickup trucks, if you are towing often or even daily, you are going to burn more oil than you would just normally driving the truck. So if you are towing regularly, I would highly recommend you check your dipstick every now and again, just to make sure you're not burning too much oil and there still is enough oil in that engine. Now, in December of 2019, Ford officially released a technical service bulletin on this issue, claiming that anyone with an F-150 made between 2018 and 2020 with the 5-liter engine and is burning more than 1 quart per 3,000 miles or 1 liter per 4,800 kilometers does fall into this category. Now, Ford claims right on this service bulletin that the issue is most likely due to high intake manifold vacuum during deceleration fuel shutoff, resulting in oil being pulled into the combustion chamber from the crankcase, valve guides, and even the PCV. Now, if your F-150 was lucky enough to be one of those trucks to fall into that service bulletin, what Ford will do is they'll change the oil, they'll change the oil filter, they'll put a new dipstick in, as well as reprogramming or updating the software on the powertrain control module. Ford claims that reprogramming the powertrain control module will help to stop any high pressure vacuum pulling oil into the combustion chamber. Now, it does seem like for whatever reason, the 2018 5-liters suffer from this the most. 2019 trucks seem to suffer less, and then 2020 even less than that. And then obviously Ford claims after 2020, this is no longer an issue. Now, I always take that with a grain of salt, but it does seem like people with the 2020 and above trucks are not experiencing this issue. At least that's what it seems like on the forums from real owners. Always interested in what you guys have to say. If you own one of these trucks from 2020 and above, let me know if this is still an issue for you guys, if your truck is actually consuming oil or not. Always love to hear from you guys. But what caught my eye, and this is again just my own speculation, is this issue started in 2018. And what happened in 2018, this is when Ford went to the spray-on cylinder liners. Now, with those, the bore actually changed. The bore got bigger. So I would imagine Ford either had to slightly change the piston or put some slightly bigger piston rings in there. And I wonder if that new liner or those new piston or piston rings maybe wasn't as sealing as the previous engines and was actually letting some oil pass into the combustion chambers. It's interesting that Ford claims in their service bulletin it's a completely different issue. Just my speculations. It's funny how, that kind of goes hand in hand, but you never know. Now, finally, in 2021, there was a class action lawsuit against Ford for the 5-liter oil consumption. In that lawsuit, they claimed that oil was passing past the piston rings into the combustion chamber and burning. Again, it's interesting how, that new cylinder liner, potentially new piston rings, and this lawsuit claiming that's what's going on is different than what Ford claimed was causing the issue in their service bulletin. I mean, take it or leave it, but it is interesting either way. But what I think is even more interesting, or what you guys are probably more concerned about, is if this issue is actually solved. Now, again, looking on the forums, seeing real, F-150 5-liter owners, it does seem like anyone owning a truck after really the year 2019, even the 2020s, don't seem to have these issues anymore. Which is why I want to hear from you guys, because I don't own one of these trucks. So I want to know if this really is resolved. It does seem like it is. And if I was buying a 5-liter, I probably wouldn't be too worried about it, in my opinion. But again, let me know what you guys think. Now, an issue of a little bit more concern is the timing chain failures or the cam phaser failures in higher mileage trucks. And luckily, this seems to completely come down to maintenance. So if you do good maintenance, you should be able to avoid this problem pretty consistently. However, I took a little bit of a deeper dive in there to see why regular maintenance makes such a big impact on this issue. So the first thing is that the cam phasers as well as the timing chain tensioners all run off engine oil pressure. And so this is why Ford says that you can only run synthetic oil in this engine, as well as making sure that you run the correct weight of oil, which I'm looking at right now is 5W30. Now, what can happen with synthetic oil is if the engine doesn't get up to temperature, you can start to get some type of crystallization on engine components. Now, this takes years and years to build up. But again, if you're driving the same truck to work and your work's only 5 minutes away, year after year, you might end up with this crystallization effect, and that can really hinder your cam phasers as well as your timing chain tensioner if that was to get into those small oil galleries and affect that. Now, if you don't believe me about synthetic oil and crystallization, I'll put a video down below where a gentleman who rebuilds Ford engines for a living rebuilds one of these 5-liter engines and shows you guys that crystallization exactly. So I'll put that video down below if you guys are interested. Now, another thing to consider, since these critical engine components rely heavily on exact engine oil pressure, is the brand of oil you use. Now, with these modern synthetic oils, there is a lot of modifiers and additives in each brand, and each brand has a different set of those. So if you are just going to, let's say, Canadian Tire and getting the cheapest synthetic oil, you know, month after month, I would highly recommend that you pick an oil you trust and you like, as well as an oil filter, and just stick with it for the life of the engine. Because what can happen sometimes when you mix those oil additives and modifiers, they can gunk up and cause gunk in these engines, which is the last thing you want. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of timing chain tensioner and cam phaser issues is the oil change interval life. Now, this seems to be the #1 contributing factor to these high mileage failures, is that people let their oil life run too long. Now, personally, I would not run synthetic oil any longer than like 6,000 miles or 10,000 kilometers. That to me seems probably like the limit you'd want to go. Also, you have to factor in time as well. I mean, I would probably want to be changing my oil at least 3 times a year, more or less probably like 4, because what happens as oil degrades, even synthetic oil, there's more likelihood that you're going to start to develop some gunk. And if that gunk was to, let's say, clog up one of the oil galleries to your, timing chain tensioners, that could cause a lot of problems. So that is why the timing chain tensioner issues as well as the cam phaser issues is highly preventable in my opinion, if you guys do good quality maintenance with good quality oil and a good quality oil filter. So those are the common issues that caught my eye. Now, if you guys want to add to that, feel free to drop a comment down below. But now I figured I'd talk about some things that personally would concern me if I was going to be buying this engine, and that maybe you guys would also find interesting. So the first thing that personally concerns me about this engine actually has to do with the 4th gen engine sitting right in front of me here. Because in 2021, when this engine came out, Ford introduced cylinder deactivation into this 5-liter platform. And to me, that's a little bit of a red flag, because Ford claims that the only reason they put that in there was to meet government emission regulations. They themselves apparently were not a fan of cylinder deactivation, and that's probably why this engine never had it until 2021. Now, the reason why I say that's a red flag is because I work on modern diesel engines for a living, and I get to work on government mandated emission systems. And every couple years, they tighten up the restrictions, and that forces manufacturers to put out products just to meet that regulation. And oftentimes, those products are very flawed because the manufacturer doesn't get to release them when they want to, but it's more like they're forced to release that with a certain truck. Now, how does that translate to this engine? Well, this engine is a dual overhead cam engine. It's quite a complex valve train system, and in order to have cylinder deactivation, you have to basically deactivate lifters, and so that would be quite a complex situation in here. And if the government was kind of forcing Ford to do that, and they didn't have time to properly do all the testing they needed and just kind of slapped it in to meet those regulations, that to me is what concerns me. Now, the second thing that somewhat personally concerns me about this engine is in 2018, Ford went away from their cast iron cylinder liners to a Sprayon Liner technology. To me, that seems much more of a performance-based product, and that's probably great for the Mustangs because it's going to lighten up the block. It actually makes the bore larger, so you're gonna get slightly bigger displacement out of this engine. My concern would lie with a pickup truck engine that's gonna be facing a lot more heat, a lot more load, a lot more often. Is it gonna hold up like a cast iron cylinder liner does? Now, that was in 2018, so I guess, you know, that's been 5 years now, and there hasn't really been too much noise around that, so it seems like it is holding up, and maybe I just gotta, maybe I'm the old dinosaur that wants those cast iron liners in there, and this is actually some really good technology. Now, the last thing that would kind of concern me, I guess, with this engine, or just something to be aware of, is that in 2021, Ford went away from a chain-driven oil pump to a belt-driven oil pump. Now, this belt is going to be Kevlar reinforced, so apparently it is a strong system. Again, just something that I thought I would bring to your attention, something to be aware of, something to keep an eye on, and see if these belts are going to hold up the test of time, if it's going to last the life of the engine, or if they're going to have to be replaced earlier before a traditional chain-driven oil pump system. So those are the 3 things that kind of caught my eye personally that I thought I would just kind of tack on top of those common issues, let you guys know what I think and all that fun stuff. So let's get to the conclusion. All right, we've talked about some specs of this engine, we've talked about some things I like, we've talked about some things I don't like, as well as some common issues. So what is my conclusion? Well, my conclusion is that this 5-liter Coyote engine is a good, strong, clean engine. Simple as that. Now, I know a couple weeks ago I had the 7.3-liter Godzilla engine here. I was also kind of praising that engine. I am by no means a Ford person. I've owned a bunch of Chevy trucks in my life, and I've obviously owned a bunch of Ram trucks. I've never owned a Ford because, in fact, I've never really liked them. But I do think this 5-liter engine is something to highly consider if you are looking in the 1500 marketplace. I think it often gets overshadowed, specifically with the Ford lineup, by the 3.5 EcoBoost, because the EcoBoost is making more power, more torque, it's a little flashier, it's faster. But I think the 5-liter is probably the engine I would go with. Now, one thing this 5-liter Coyote is not is simple. A traditional pushrod V8 from its competitors like GM as well as Ram is a much simpler design engine. However, I think Ford has done a really good job with the, first of all, manufacturing process as well as the design, because despite the fact that it's not a simple engine, it has very good reliability and good power out of it. Now, one point about power that I would like to mention is that, you know, its competitors, the 6.2-liter LS engine from GM or even the LT engine, it is going to feel a little bit more torquey down low because it just is a naturally aspirated pushrod V8. This thing makes a lot of its power in the higher RPM bands, so if you're looking for something that's really torquey, the 5-liter Coyote engine may not be what you're necessarily looking for, because the low-end torque is not going to be there in comparison to the 6.4 HEMI or the 6.2 GM engine. Not to say that this thing is not powerful, because like we mentioned in this video, this thing will rev to like 7,000 RPM, and when you get above 5,000-6,000 RPM, this thing is like a rocket ship. So that is my opinion. I do like this engine. Hopefully you guys found this information helpful, and I can't wait to strap a trailer behind this. Like I said, next week I'm gonna go pick up a trailer, which should be fun. As always, if you like the video, don't forget to leave that thumbs up, and if you like cool stuff like this, don't forget to subscribe, because we'd love to have you on board. Anyways, enough of me. We'll see you in the next freaking video.